The basic arrangement of the muscles, that the first one is the external oblique. Okay, external oblique. Then we have the internal oblique. Okay. Then we have the muscle transversus abdominis, and then we have the fascia transversalis. Okay, FT. So this is the basic arrangement of the layers in the abdominal wall. Now what happens is that this external oblique, it basically comes down and it forms the interior wall of the canal. Okay, I'm just drawing a hypothetical diagram like this, and then what happens is that it hangs down and it rolls on itself, let's say like this. Okay, it rolls on itself, and as it rolls on itself, it is going to form the floor of the inguinal canal. So this is the anterior wall, and this is the floor, and this is all going to be formed by the external oblique muscle. Okay, now as it rolls upon itself to form the floor, the ligament that is formed is known as the inguinal ligament. So this is the inguinal ligament forming the floor, which is how is it formed. When the external oblique muscle hangs down, it rolls upon itself. Now this is about the external oblique. Now we're going to talk about the internal oblique and the transverse abdominis. Now this internal oblique mainly forms the roof. Okay, as we can see that it is present above, and the thing is that this internal oblique and this transverse abdominis, they kind of fuse, and as they fuse, they form the conjoint tendon. Okay. So students get very confused about what is the conjoint tendon. It is formed when the internal oblique and the transverse abdominis, they fuse, they form the conjoint tendon, and this is going to form the roof of the canal. So the floor of the canal was formed by the inguinal ligament and the roof is formed by the conjoint tendon. Now what happens is that they also extend down. This transverse abdominis muscle, it extends down, and it extends down, the fascia transversalis also extends down along with it, and as they extend down and they fuse with each other, they also form a tract which is known as the Ileopubic Track, and it forms the posterior aspect of some part of the floor. Okay, this Ileopubic Tract is also forming. So the floor is mainly formed by the inguinal ligament, but also some part of the Ileopubic Tract, which is formed by the fusion of the transverse abdominis and the fascia transversalis. Okay, so why I have left this gap between the layers, I have left this intentionally so that I can also explain the spaces later on. But the thing is that always remember that fascia transversalis is a two-layered structure. Okay, so it has two layers, and these two layers, there's a space between these two layers, and that space actually has vessels, and this is a vascular space. So what is the significance? That is which is the reason for which we can never place a mesh. No, never place a mesh between the fascia transversalis layers, because it is a vascular region and it's going to be extremely dangerous if the vessels get damaged and bleeding. So over here in between, never place a mesh. Okay, so now this is the posterior wall is also being formed by the transverse abdominis and the fascia transversalis. So let's have a look at a better picture that I drew. So this is color coded, so you can see that this is the, let me just, okay, large this, okay, this is the external oblique muscle, and it is going to extend down to form the interior wall of the canal, and then this is going to roll upon itself to form the inguinal ligament, which is forming the floor of the inguinal canal. And then this is the internal oblique muscle, and this is the transverse abdominis, and by the fusion of both of these muscles, we have the conjoint tendon, transverse abdominis and internal oblique fusion, and this is going to form the roof. And this internal oblique is not going to extend downwards, but transverse abdominis is extending downwards, and the fascia transversalis, which has two layers, is also extending downwards, and they both are forming the posterior wall of the canal, and as they extend downward, they roll upon themselves to form the Ileopubic Track, which is also forming the posterior aspect of the floor of the canal. Okay, so if I talk about the roof, the majority of the roof is formed by the internal oblique, and medial part is formed by the conjoint tendon. Okay, now this is, as you can see, this is the deep ring which is present as a defect in the fascia transversalis, and the base of the deep ring over here below this is, you can see, is formed by the Ileopubic Tract. Okay, so what happens is that we can see that through these rings, vas deferens is entering from the medial side, and we can also see that the vessels, they are also, passing through this deep ring from the lateral side. So when someone asks you that in the deep ring from the medial side what enters, there is vast difference, and from the lateral side what enters, they are the spermatic vessels. So another picture, only the posterior wall. This is the transverse abdominis and this is the fascia transversalis, and these are the two layers of fascia transversalis. And you can see that this is a defect in the posterior wall, a defect in the fascia transversalis, and medially we have the vas deferens, and laterally we have the spermatic vessels entering through this deep ring, and there is the ileopubic tract which is formed by the fusion of transverse abdominis and fascia transversalis.